And I was hit by the bus and dragged underneath the wheel. And I was on the floor with my leg like this, underneath the wheel of the bus for about a minute and a half.
Wow.
And in that time, I experienced what people call a near-death experience, out-of-body experience, NDE.
So welcome to Soul Food Sunday. For this week's Soul Food Sunday, we have something I think which is pretty special. I've actually just recorded an interview with Renu Arora, who was actually a former patient of the Optimal Health Clinic about 14 years ago, and went through her own recovery journey with chronic fatigue in the early days of Optimal Health Clinic, and also was a student on our practitioner training. And she, 2.25 or so years ago, was hit by a bus. Something that people joke about, being hit by a bus. She was actually hit by a bus, and she talks about the story. And she had a near-death experience as a result of this. And it's been a significant journey as a result of having life-changing injuries. But also really what we get into in this dialogue is how this experience has really changed her and changed the way that she perceives and views the world and her life. This is, I think, an extraordinary story, and I think there's going to be lots of pieces I would love to have got into here, but we were kind of limited on time. But also we talked towards the end about a podcast series that Renu herself is putting together, and a crowdfunder which you can support if you're impacted or touched by this story. So this is Renu, and this is her story of being hit by a bus. So Renu, we've known each other for a while.
Oh.
I don't think we've spoken for about, I think it must be 12 or 13 years or something. So you were a patient of Optimal Health Clinic in the early years, and you also did the practitioner course, I think, as well. From what
I did,
yeah,
and I loved it, and I still refer back to some of those nuggets in my life now.
Good. I'm pleased to hear that. And then, your life has kind of evolved and continued from that point. And then 2.25 or so years ago, you had a pretty significant life event. And just tell us a bit about the kind of what happened, and then let's see where we go from there in terms of kind of inner, I guess, experience from it.
The what? I work as a storyteller, actor, singer, director. I work in theatre, and I was coming home from a day of work, pretty exhausting day. So it was just by my house, and I was on the pavement, and a bus came in too quickly and caught the edge of my boot and dragged my foot under the wheel and my leg, and stopped just below my knee. And I was on the floor, and I obviously toppled over at the time. And I was hit by the bus and dragged underneath the wheel. And I was on the floor with my leg like this, underneath the wheel of the bus for about a minute and a half.
Wow.
And in that time, I experienced what people call a near-death experience, out-of-body experience, NDE. For me, that involved kind of floating up and seeing my body underneath the wheel of this bus and having this crazy, which for me was amazing, kind of, transcendental, where I feel, it might sound a bit woo-woo, where I feel like I experienced the other world, experienced some kind of God, which you kind of read all about all these things, that there is no time in that space and all that stuff. But yet I'd never kind of known it here in my heart.
Yes.
Yeah. And I lived in that space, and it was a few weeks after the accident where I kind of realized that had happened, because obviously I was so traumatized from the event. But since then, there's just been a whole huge journey of obviously, because obviously I've got a disability now, adjusting to the physical aspect of my mobility, adjusting to the trauma, processing all the trauma, the emotions, but also the spiritual journey, which has been in many ways my saving grace through all of this. Yes. That's the one thing I feel so grateful for, which is massively kind of balanced all the horror.
Yes. And you had that kind of transcendental experience. How long did that last? Because I guess at some point then you were dragged back into physical reality, which I assume would have been kind of unimaginably painful physically and emotionally. And what was the sequence of how that unfolded?
Do you mean
In the actual event. So like you're floating above in this kind of tasting God, and then at some point you're probably not anymore. So how did that play out?
Yeah, I mean, there were a sequence of events that happened. I won't go too much into it because I'm creating a series of podcasts at the moment, and some of the story is going to be reserved for that. But I mean, in a nutshell, I felt like I was giving various messages in that place about love and giving love, and love is all there is. It also felt like my heart was literally taken out of my chest, given a good polish, and then put back in again. And I felt like I'd been filled up to the brim with love that cannot be depleted. Because it's not a human love. It's not like I give too much and it goes. It's just this love, this ever-present being that seems to feel like it's always there. And I knew in that moment that it would always be there. And I felt like I was, like my wingspan felt like it was the whole of North London and back and more.
Wow.
I felt wide rather than deep, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Sorry.
And then but I imagine there was also a trauma element to this, right? Like I'm wondering about, there's what one might call the grace and the grit. So you got the grace. I'm wondering where did the grit come? Like
So I screamed, and the scream, I felt like it was literally pulling me back into my body like a hoover. I was sucked back in. It was the most strangest feeling in that moment. To suddenly be back, I felt like I'd only screamed half the scream, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I only remember screaming the tail end of that scream.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then I imagine over the coming kind of days, just initially there was a kind of processing of like what this meant for your life and the kind of physical recovery and the kind of, how was that journey?
Oh, massive. As I'm sure you can imagine. For lots of reasons, I didn't get the treatment that I needed physically for my injuries for about 5 weeks. Excuse me. So I was sitting, in my flat with 8 bones that were broken. Some were in 3 pieces without any painkillers.
Wow.
Without any painkillers. Just absolutely insane. It was, so that was where a lot of the journey took place in those first 5 weeks. Where I felt like I had to find a way to make it through each moment, because my world in those first 5 weeks was broken down into moments, literally moments. Because all I could do in that space was just breathe to get through the pain.
Yes.
Breathe and breathe and breathe. And every few minutes I changed position because the pain was so intense.
Did you feel, I think it comes to my mind, I wonder if the years that you were kind of severely kind of affected by chronic fatigue, did that prepare you or help you or not? I mean, I could argue it both ways. Yeah.
Great question. It did help me a lot, because all of the insight that we learned, both on the practitioner course and having sessions at the clinic, about listening to my body, making friends with pain, but I suppose what's the word? Empathy. All the insights about empathy and how to hold a space and how to hold the space for yourself. All of that came into play hugely.
And I imagine that there was a kind of trauma, kind of shock response that often happens when people go through major kind of physical traumas. The nervous system kind of freezes, and that's one of the ways that we tend to survive those kind of experiences.
Yes.
I'm wondering how that then unfolded as that freeze response gradually came off. Sometimes the trauma becomes more obvious over time.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it felt like I'd put my finger into a socket and I'd been zinged. And I felt like that for the best part of 1.5 years, if not 2 years. Obviously, gradually, it's slowly dissipated.
Yes.
But for a very long time, I felt like I'd been, when you, analogy, when you go into a tube station and you've got the big black tunnel, I felt like my heart was a big black tunnel that the bus had driven through, that was so hollow that anybody could see through. I felt that raw for a very, very long time.
Wow. And I guess I wonder also, I mean, I have so many questions and I realize we have a limited amount of time and hopefully people will go to the podcast in time to get more answers to these questions. But I suppose one of my questions is also just how you then, the events like this happen and there's that kind of initial shock and trauma and kind of rallying of internal resource to like, I've just got to survive each minute kind of to get through. And then gradually, as we survive that initial kind of impact, it's then like, what does that mean for your life? Like how you figure out, like, as you said, you now have a disability, and how does that impact who Renu is, and what you're just on so many levels of like your physical reality to your kind of your career to your purpose. Like, how's the unfolding of that all been for you?
How do you fit that into a 5-minute answer?
Well, I realize it's an unfair question. Perhaps pick what feels most pertinent in the question for now.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. You know, what I read a brilliant book actually after the accident called, well, it was about a year ago, called Surviving Survival, which
great title. I don't know the book, but it's a great title.
Yeah, and it's about how the author took various stories of people that had experienced this kind of, you know, big one-off trauma, and spoke about the fact that the actual journey of survival starts once you've survived it. And then the journey starts, and it really, the penny dropped for me, because I just thought, this is the reason why I feel so deeply lost. You know, because you kind of go, well, who am I now? What am I now? Why am I now? Where am I now? Because also I was kind of flitting between the two worlds in many ways. I didn't kind of feel like I fully kind of came back from that space, from that transcendental space, for a very, very long time. And I think part of me is still there, but the part of me that's still there now, I feel like I can now use it in this world, if that makes sense, rather than feeling like I wanted to be back in that place.
How does it change your, and again, I know this is a really big question, but just for what kind of comes up for you in this moment about it, how does this change how you see the purpose of your life, like how you see what your life is about? Because it sounds like something, lots of pieces have quite fundamentally been altered by this experience. But yeah, I'm just curious as to what comes to mind in this moment when you think about that.
I mean, if I can, just to go back to your previous question a little bit about the physical aspect. Obviously, there's been a huge physical journey to adjust to. I have to walk with walking aids now, and I can't properly stand, so I can't do things like cook as much by myself anymore. And a lot of the physical day-to-day, you know, running of my life has been affected. I can't run. You know what I mean? Has been affected and impacted by this. But in terms of purpose, I feel, I mean, as I said, I'm working on a series of podcasts at the moment, which there's 12 podcasts, and they're going to be telling stories of different facets of this journey, the spiritual aspect, the aftermath of the trauma, in the hope that it will inspire other people who are going through any profound journey. It doesn't have to be a trauma like this, but anything profound. I realized through all of my reading since the accident that the post-trauma journey has a specific texture. It's almost like it's got its own heartbeat. It lives on its own. And for me, one of the biggest things for me in my recovery and in my journey has been to really, really honor that. Because obviously, you know, there are societal expectations of trauma, of how you deal with a post-trauma journey, and there's my own. And I really had to kind of be strong and steadfast in what it meant for me, and honoring that, and honoring the fact that there is no time for me, because I've come back from that space with a very altered view of time, having experienced this timelessness in that space, and coming back and going, well, in this world, time is linear. But for me, it doesn't feel linear at all. So just kind of allowing myself and my spirit and my heart just to be in the moment with whatever's going on with this huge journey that's happening, and allow my body, my mind, my spirit to process it in a way that it feels like it wants to, and at the pace that it feels that it wants to. So for me, a big part of my life and my purpose for me going forward now feels like it's going to be around inspiring people. That's a strange word, you know, but I think you know what I mean. Yeah, sure. Talking to people about the journey, making work through my own medium, so storytelling, singing, acting, you know, through the skills that I have, about the story, about the journey, so that other people can feel a sense of reflection. Because I really believe, and I use this as one of my hashtags in the project, that stories inspire stories. I really believe that.
Well, I think one of the things that also strikes me, that it's like you had a massive kind of insight and experience, like a kind of like a fundamental shift in your perception of reality. But then the integration of those experiences can take a lifetime. You know, it's like, it's almost, how do you translate that to daily life, and kind of to your relationship to yourself, to your relationship to the world, to your purpose? Like, it's there's so much to that integration and metabolization and digestion. And people often forget that that's the real journey in a sense, right? It's not the big insight, it's what the big insight then means in integration into one's life.
100%. And that's where I think that book's talking about the surviving survival. But as you say beautifully, that is the journey. That's where the journey is. Exactly. And I think it does take a lifetime. I'm still on the journey. I think I will be for the rest of my life. But yeah, that is the journey.
What from the where you're at so far, and it's very much it's an unfolding thing, and I think that's part of what's so powerful. I think about what you're sharing is actually you're living it rather than wrapping it up in a nice neat box and serving it up as a kind of the wrapper on it and saying, "Here's what I learned." In a sense, that there's I think the unfolding to me at least, I always find that more impactful and more powerful because I think it's more real. But I suppose one of the questions that comes to mind is, when you think about that you who was at that beginning of this integration journey, so you'd had this big experience of massive trauma, but also a big insight, and then you were kind of, pulled between, I guess, in a sense, two worlds. And I'm sure people watching this or listening to this can certainly perhaps not resonate with the magnitude of the experience that you've had, but can resonate with that moment of like, it feels like someone's ripped the rug out from underneath your life. And it's like, what would you say to that you at that time? Or what would you say to someone that's watching or listening that's just in a state of kind of frozen shock about what's happened to them? Yeah. What would you offer in terms of insight from this place where you are now?
That's a really beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. One of the words that I've resonated the most with during this process is gentleness. Being gentle with myself through all this has been absolutely huge. There are some days I slept for 16 hours because my body was so shocked, so exhausted, so traumatized, in so much pain that all I could do was sleep. And, the old me would have judged myself for that and said, you've got to get up, you've got things to do, time pressure. Well, there is no time for me now, but, so it's been a real sense of just be gentle, just be gentle. And I know that sounds a bit cliched and maybe it's, not that big and huge, but it's been a massive part of the journey for me, is to actually empathize with myself and give myself that holding space that I've needed to allow the journey to unfold. Because a friend of mine said to me a while ago, he said, with things like this that are so huge in terms of trauma, they don't integrate into you, you move into them.
Interesting.
And the penny dropped for me at that point. I went, yeah, that's what it is. So I just have to allow it to unfold. Whatever it is for every person that's listening will be different. For me, it was this whole process, this whole journey, all the facets of the journey that I needed to move into, the spiritual, the physical, the emotional, all of it, the psychological. Go on.
Yeah, well, I was just going to, I think that I think that's absolutely right. And also I wanted to respond to what you're saying on with the gentleness, that I think one of the things that happens, one of the things that needs to happen on a healing journey like this is someone's will and determination has to be activated, because just to get through the agonizing pain, there needs to be a rising of that quality of I can do this, even when one feels like they can't do it. There has to be some kind of rising of will. But normally, for most of us, when our will rises, it comes with a harshness. So it comes with a kind of inner critic quality, or a kind of forcefulness, or a kind of pushing quality to it. And I think it's a psychologically quite a difficult inner development, but I think it's a really important one, not just in a moment of crisis, just I think generally for life, to be able to hold will with love and softness, for those two qualities to coexist. And it sounds like that's part of what you learned, that you needed the will to survive and the will to get through, but you also had to to marry that up with a sense of self-care and gentleness, and yeah, that's been a big part of the journey as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Because I have and always have had a very strong inner critic. And so that will and determination really does bring up all those, well, you must, you should, and all those very sort of harsh patterns that I would beat myself up with. And so I knew that the will for me needed to be a surrendering. And that for me was the gentlest way that I could activate that will, was just to surrender to this process.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to do, but it is critical.
Very hard thing to do, and I still struggle with it. But for me, it's because I've realised that it's for me it's the only way to allow myself to be in this space and in this process. The gentleness was imperative, really, and also because of the fact that my heart has been so. I said in the early days, my heart feels like it's been blown open. I couldn't not be gentle with myself.
Yeah.
Because I've been, for the first sort of year or so, I was so very fragile. I would cry every day.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So there's, in a sense, I think hopefully this will be the beginning of a dialogue of this, people, not the end, because there's a podcast series that's coming. So, tell us a little bit about the Burgundy book and that you mentioned that it's going to be 12 podcasts. Yes. I know you got a crowdfunder, and I'm looking at it at this point of recording. You're already halfway, which, by the way, is an achievement and a hard thing to do in a crowdfunder. Most crowdfunders don't succeed, so it looks like you're going to get there. But hopefully, people watching or listening to this might feel they can support. So, just say a little bit about that. We'll include a link up for where we can. I guess on some places, certainly on YouTube and Facebook, there'll be a link underneath. I know that Instagram you can't do links, and podcasts is not so easy. But maybe I guess people can put the Burgundy book into Indiegogo to find it. But just say a little bit about it.
And I'm on Facebook as well and Twitter, and people can find me there too and connect.
Great.
So the Burgundy book is a series of 12 arts podcasts, because they're artistic in their nature and their response, and they're telling, like I said, sort of little short stories about different aspects of the accident. Right from the very profound, the near-death experience, some of the big changes that I've had to integrate and adjust to, and also some of the mundane things. So, for example, going to a coffee shop and buying a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, whilst we take those things for granted, when you've had a trauma, those things can mean so much more. So it's, I kind of flip between the mundane and the profound in all the different stories that I tell, and putting some original music and some of my own singing into the stories as well. And so they'll be released on iTunes roughly about December time. And the crowdfunder is to raise money for the production costs of the project. Yeah. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, producing podcasts is quite a lot of work, believe it or not. So I and my team have been discovering the last few weeks. Why the Burgundy book? What's the story behind the title?
Oh, I can't reveal that, Alex.
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. I'll leave it as a cliffhanger.
You'll have to hear the podcast.
Great.
It's to do with the NDE, but I won't say any more than that.
Okay, very good. So please, people watching, listening, go and check it out. And if you can support, I think that would be really appreciated. And Renu, also, you can let me know when it's released, and we can let people know then as well. Thank you so much for being willing to share so vulnerably of your story. I think it's a great gift to the world for you to take the experience that's clearly been on one level horrific and to turn that into something positive. So thank you for sharing it.
Can I just say one very quick last thing? I don't believe that an experience so massive would have been given to me personally, this is my belief, unless it was to benefit other people in some way as well. So it felt like a very natural thing to go, okay, how can I use this?
Yeah, that's wonderful. And it takes courage to do that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for having me on, Alex. What a joy. Thank you.
Right, well, thank you. Let's not leave it so many years, but let's also try to find a slightly less traumatic experience to trigger a conversation.
Yes, exactly. Great. Thank you, Alex. I really appreciate it.
So please do support Renu in her crowdfunding project if you feel inclined to do so. It's clearly an amazing story and an amazingly brave way which she's making meaning out of this and taking it forwards. So I think as a kind of next step really in terms of following this up, tomorrow on Mindful Monday, we have an excerpt from an interview with one of my teachers, Tejo Jordan, who's a teacher of the Diamond Approach, talking about the inner critic. And one of the things that helps meeting our place for ourselves from a more gentle and more loving place is having more distance and space from our inner critic. So I look forward to talking with you on Mindful Monday tomorrow.